Chapter 3. The Object of Linguistics. 1. Definition of language. What is both the integral and concrete object of linguistics? The question is especially difficult. Later we shall see why. Here I wish merely to point up the difficulty. Other sciences work with objects that are given in advance and that can then be considered from different viewpoints, but not linguistics. Someone pronounces the French word nu, be. A superficial observer would be tempted to call the word a concrete linguistic object, but a more careful examination would reveal successively 3 or 4 quite different things, depending on whether the word is considered as a sound, as the expression of an idea, as the equivalent of the Latin nudum, etc. Far from it being the object that antedates the viewpoint, it would seem that it is the viewpoint that creates the object. Besides, nothing tells us in advance that one way of considering the fact in question takes precedence over the others or is in any way superior to them. Moreover, regardless of the viewpoint that we adopt, the linguistic phenomenon always has two related sides, each deriving its value from the other. For example, 1. Articulated syllables are acoustical impressions perceived by the ear, but the sounds would not exist without the vocal organs. An N sound exists only by virtue of the relation between the two sides. We simply cannot reduce language to sound or detach sound from oral articulation. Reciprocally, we cannot define the movements of the vocal organs without taking into account the acoustical impression. 2. But suppose that sound were a simple thing. Would it constitute speech? No, it is only the instrument of thought. By itself, it has no existence. At this point, a new and redoubtable relationship arises. A sound, a complex acoustical vocal unit, combines in turn with an idea to form a complex physiological psychological unit, but that is still not the complete picture. 3. Speech has both an individual and a social side, and we cannot conceive of one without the other. Besides, 4. Speech always implies both an established system and an evolution. At every moment it is an existent institution and a product of the past. To distinguish between the system and its history, between what it is and what it was, seems very simple at first glance. Actually, the two things are so closely related that we can scarcely keep them apart. Would we simplify the question by studying the linguistic phenomenon in its earliest stages? If we began, for example, by studying the speech of children? No, for in dealing with speech, it is completely misleading to assume that the problem of early characteristics differs from the problem of permanent characteristics. We are left inside the vicious circle. From whatever direction we approach the question, nowhere do we find the integral object of linguistics. Everywhere we are confronted with a dilemma. If we fix our attention on only one side of each problem, we run the risk of failing to perceive the dualities pointed out above. On the other hand, if we study speech from several viewpoints simultaneously, the object of linguistics appears to us as a confused mass of heterogeneous and unrelated things. Either procedure opens the door to several sciences, psychology, anthropology, normative grammar, philology, etc., which are distinct from linguistics, but which might claim speech in view of the faulty method of linguistics as one of their objects. As I see it, there is only one solution to all the foregoing difficulties. from the very outset we must put both feet on the ground of language and use a language as the norm of all other manifestations of speech. Actually, among so many dualities, language alone seems to lend itself to independent definition and provide a fulcrum that satisfies the mind. But what is language? Langue. It is not to be confused with human speech, langage, of which it is only a definite part, though certainly an essential one. It is both the social product of the faculty of speech and a collection of necessary conventions that have been adopted by a social body to permit individuals to exercise that faculty. Taken as a whole, speech is many-sided and heterogeneous, straddling several areas simultaneously. Physical, physiological, and psychological. It belongs both to the individual and to society. We cannot put it into any category of human facts, for we cannot discover its unity. Language, on the contrary, is a self-contained whole and a principle of classification. As soon as we give language first place among the facts of speech, we introduce a natural order into a mass that lends itself to no other classification. One might object to that principle of classification on the ground that since the use of speech is based on a natural faculty, whereas language is something acquired and conventional, language should not take first place but should be subordinated to the natural instinct. That objection is easily refuted. First, no one has proved that speech, as it manifests itself when we speak, is entirely natural. It is that our vocal apparatus was designed for speaking just as our legs were designed for walking. Linguists are far from agreement on this point. For instance, Whitney, to whom language is one of several social institutions, thinks that we use the vocal apparatus as the instrument of language purely through luck, for the sake of convenience. Men might just as well have chosen gestures and used visual symbols instead of acoustical symbols. Doubtless, his thesis is too dogmatic. Language is not similar in all respects to other social institutions. Moreover, Whitney goes too far in saying that our choice happened to fall on the vocal organs. The choice was more or less imposed by nature. But on the essential point, the American linguist is right. Language is a convention, and the nature of the sign that is agreed upon does not matter. The question of the vocal apparatus obviously takes a secondary place in the problem of speech. One definition of articulated speech might confirm that conclusion. In Latin, articulus means a member, part, or subdivision of a sequence. Applied to speech, articulation designates either the subdivision of a spoken chain into syllables or the subdivision of the chain of meanings into significant units. Gegliederte Sprache is used in the second sense in German. Using the second definition, we can say that what is natural to mankind is not oral speech, but the faculty of constructing a language. It is a system of distinct signs corresponding to distinct ideas. Brockett discovered that the faculty of speech is localized in the third left frontal convolution. His discovery has been used to substantiate the attribution of a natural quality to speech. But we know that the same part of the brain is the center of everything that has to do with speech, including writing. The preceding statements, together with observations that have been made in different cases of aphasia resulting from lesion of the centers of localization, seem to indicate 1. That the various disorders of oral speech are bound up in 100 ways with those of written speech, and 2. that what is lost in all cases of aphasia or agraphia is less the faculty of producing a given sound or writing a given sign than the ability to evoke by means of an instrument, regardless of what it is, the signs of a regular system of speech. The obvious implication is that beyond the functioning of the various organs, there exists a more general faculty which governs signs and which would be the linguistic faculty proper. And this brings us to the same conclusion as above. To give language first place in the study of speech, we can advance a final argument. The faculty of articulating words, whether it is natural or not, is exercised only with the help of the instrument created by the collectivity and provided for its use. Therefore, to say that language gives unity to speech is not fanciful. 2. Place of language in the facts of speech. In order to separate from the whole of speech the part that belongs to language, we must examine the individual act from which the speaking circuit can be reconstructed. The act requires the presence of at least two persons. That is the minimum number necessary to complete the circuit. Suppose that two people, A and B, are conversing with each other. Suppose that the opening of the circuit is in A's brain, where mental facts, concepts, are associated with representations of the linguistic sounds, sound images, that are used for their expression. A given concept unlocks a corresponding sound image in the brain. This purely psychological phenomenon is followed in turn by a physiological process. The brain transmits an impulse corresponding to the image to the organs used in producing sounds. Then, the sound waves travel from the mouth of A to the ear of B. Next, the circuit continues in B, but the order is reversed. From the ear to the brain, the physiological transmission of the sound image. In the brain, the psychological association of the image with the corresponding concept. If B then speaks, the new act will follow, from his brain to A's, exactly the same course as the first act, and pass through the same successive phases. The preceding analysis does not purport to be complete. We might also single out the pure acoustical sensation, the identification of that sensation with the latent sound image, the muscular image of phonation, etc. I have included only the elements thought to be essential, but the drawing brings out at a glance the distinction between the physical, sound waves, physiological, phonation and audition, and psychological parts, word images and concepts. Indeed, we should not fail to note that the word image stands apart from the sound itself, and that it is just as psychological as the concept which is associated with it. The circuit that I have outlined can be further divided into A. An outer part that includes the vibrations of the sounds which travel from the mouth to the ear, and an inner part that includes everything else. B. A psychological and a non-psychological part, the second including the physiological productions of the vocal organs as well as the physical facts that are outside the individual. C. An active and a passive part. Everything that goes from the associative center of the speaker to the ear of the listener is active, and everything that goes from the ear of the listener to his associative center is passive. D. Finally, everything that is active in the psychological part of the circuit is executive, and everything that is passive is receptive. We should also add the associative and coordinating faculty that we find as soon as we leave isolated signs. This faculty plays the dominant role in the organization of language as a system. But To understand clearly the role of the associative and coordinating faculty, we must leave the individual act, which is only the embryo of speech, and approach the social fact. Among all the individuals that are linked together by speech, some sort of average will be set up. All will reproduce, not exactly, of course, but approximately, the same signs united with the same concepts. How does the social crystallization of language come about? Which parts of the circuit are involved? For all parts probably do not participate equally in it. The non-psychological part can be rejected from the outset. When we hear people speaking a language that we do not know, we perceive the sounds, but remain outside the social fact, because we do not understand them. Neither is the psychological part of the circuit wholly responsible. The executive side is missing, for execution is never carried out by the collectivity. Execution is always individual, and the individual is always its master. I shall call the executive side speaking, parole. Through the functioning of the receptive and coordinating faculties, impressions that are perceptibly the same for all are made on the minds of speakers. How can that social product be pictured in such a way that language will stand apart from everything else? If we could embrace the sum of the word images stored in the minds of all individuals, we could identify the social bond that constitutes language. It is a storehouse filled by the members of a given community through their active use of speaking, a grammatical system that has a potential existence in each brain, or more specifically, in the brains of a group of individuals. For language is not complete in any speaker. It exists perfectly only within a collectivity. In separating language from speaking, we are at the same time separating 1. What is social from what is individual, and 2. What is essential from what is accessory and more or less accidental. Language is not a function of the speaker. It is a product that is passively assimilated by the individual. It never requires premeditation, and reflection enters in only for the purpose of classification, which we shall take up later. Speaking, on the contrary, is an individual act. It is willful and intellectual. Within the act, we should distinguish between 1. The combinations by which the speaker uses the language code for expressing his own thought, and 2. The psychophysical mechanism that allows him to exteriorize those combinations. Note that I have defined things rather than words. These definitions are not endangered by certain ambiguous words that do not have identical meanings in different languages. For instance, German Sprache means both language and speech. Rede almost corresponds to speaking, but adds the special connotation of discourse. Latin sermo designates both speech and speaking, while lingua means language, etc. No word corresponds exactly to any of the notions specified above. That is why all definitions of words are made in vain. Starting from words in defining things is a bad procedure. To summarize, these are the characteristics of language. 1. Language is a well-defined object in the heterogeneous mass of speech facts. It can be localized in the limited segment of the speaking circuit where an auditory image becomes associated with a concept. It is the social side of speech, outside the individual, who can never create nor modify it by himself. It exists only by virtue of a sort of contract signed by the members of a community. Moreover, the individual must always serve an apprenticeship in order to learn the functioning of language. A child assimilates it only gradually. It is such a distinct thing that a man deprived of the use of speaking retains it, provided that he understands the vocal signs that he hears. 2. Language, unlike speaking, is something that we can study separately. Although dead languages are no longer spoken, we can easily assimilate their linguistic organisms. We can dispense with the other elements of speech. Indeed, the science of language is possible only if the other elements are excluded. 3. Whereas speech is heterogeneous, language, as defined, is homogeneous. It is a system of signs in which the only essential thing is the union of meanings and sound images, and in which both parts of the sign are psychological. 4. Language is concrete, no less so than speaking, and this is a help in our study of it. Linguistic signs, though basically psychological, are not abstractions. Associations which bear the stamp of collective approval and which added together constitute language are realities that have their seat in the brain. Besides, linguistic signs are tangible. It is possible to reduce them to conventional written symbols, whereas it would be impossible to provide detailed photographs of acts of speaking, actes de parole. The pronunciation of even the smallest word represents an infinite number of muscular movements that could be identified and put into graphic form only with great difficulty. In language, on the contrary, there is only the sound image, and the latter can be translated into a fixed visual image. For if we disregard the vast number of movements necessary for the realization of sound images in speaking, we see that each sound image is nothing more than the sum of a limited number of elements or phonemes that can in turn be called up by a corresponding number of written symbols. The very possibility of putting the things that relate to language into graphic form allows dictionaries and grammars to represent it accurately, for language is a storehouse of sound images, and writing is the tangible form of those images. 3. Place of language in human facts. Semiology. The foregoing characteristics of language reveal an even more important characteristic. Language, once its boundaries have been marked off within the speech data, can be classified among human phenomena, whereas speech cannot. We have just seen that language is a social institution, but several features set it apart from other political, legal, etc. institutions. We must call in a new type of facts in order to illuminate the special nature of language. Language is a system of signs that express ideas, and is therefore comparable to a system of writing, the alphabet of deaf-mutes, symbolic rites, polite formulas, military signals, etc. But it is the most important of all these systems. A science that studies the life of signs within society is conceivable. It would be a part of social psychology and consequently of general psychology. I shall call it semiology, from Greek semeion, sign. Semiology would show what constitutes signs, what laws govern them. Since the science does not yet exist, no one can say what it would be. But it has a right to existence, a place staked out in advance. Linguistics is only a part of the general science of semiology. The laws discovered by semiology will be applicable to linguistics, and the latter will circumscribe a well-defined area within the mass of anthropological facts. To determine the exact place of semiology is the task of the psychologist. The task of the linguist is to find out what makes language a special system within the mass of semiological data. This issue will be taken up again later. Here I wish merely to call attention to one thing. If I have succeeded in assigning linguistics a place among the sciences, it is because I have related it to semiology. Why has semiology not yet been recognized as an independent science with its own object, like all the other sciences? Linguists have been going around in circles. Language, better than anything else, offers a basis for understanding the semiological problem. But language must, to put it correctly, be studied in itself. Heretofore, language has almost always been studied in connection with something else, from other viewpoints. There is, first of all, the superficial notion of the general public. People see nothing more than a name-giving system in language, thereby prohibiting any research into its true nature. Then there is the viewpoint of the psychologist, who studies the sign mechanism in the individual. This is the easiest method, but it does not lead beyond individual execution and does not reach the sign, which is social. Or even when signs are studied from a social viewpoint, only the traits that attach language to other social institutions, those that are more or less voluntary, are emphasized. As a result, the goal is bypassed, and the specific characteristics of semiological systems in general, and of language in particular, are completely ignored. For the distinguishing characteristic of the sign, but the one that is least apparent at first sight, is that in some way it always eludes the individual or social will. In short, the characteristic that distinguishes semiological systems from all other institutions shows up clearly only in language, where it manifests itself in the things which are studied least, and the necessity or specific value of a semiological science is therefore not clearly recognized. But to me the language problem is mainly semiological, and all developments derive their significance from that important fact. If we are to discover the true nature of language, we must learn what it has in common with all other semiological systems. Linguistic forces that seem very important at first glance, exempli gratia, the role of the vocal apparatus, will receive only secondary consideration if they serve only to set language apart from the other systems. This procedure will do more than to clarify the linguistic problem. By studying rites, customs, etc. as signs, I believe that we shall throw new light on the facts and point up the need for including them in a science of semiology and explaining them by its laws.